Hello, BookTube. I'm Jonathan, and today I'm going to be answering the question, which authors belong on the Mount Rushmore of science fiction? And this isn't actually that easy a task. There's a lot of great authors to choose from, and I know there's going to be some split opinions on this because I actually posted this question on YouTube and received about 100 answers with over 30 authors being nominated. So later in the video, I'm going to show you which authors got the most votes, and we'll see if they line up with my picks. So to kick things off, what criteria am I going to be using in order to place people on Mount Rushmore? So there's a few different ways to do this, but in the end, what I settled on was what I feel is a somewhat all-encompassing approach, using the elements of critical acclaim, commercial success, historical significance, and influence on the genre. And I know what you're thinking, Jonathan, you're just going to be biased. You're just going to pick your favorites. Well, I'm going to prove to you that I'm not doing this because I'm actually going to be providing two lists. I'm going to give you a Mount Jonathan, and I'm going to give you a Mount Rushmore. On Mount Jonathan, I'm going to be as biased as I want. I'm just going to be picking my favorite authors from each of the nominated eras, which I'll get to it in a second. Whereas Mount Rushmore, I'm going to try to be as objective as possible, a neutral third party, if you will, and you can let me know at the end whether you think I did a good job. Now, when it comes to my four selections, I wanted to represent the history of science fiction. So I have chosen to select one author from four different eras. I don't think it would be wrong to select authors from the same era, but this is the approach I'm going to use for the video. And there's probably more than four eras in the history of science fiction, so I've had to sort of tweak and combine things a little, but you've only got 4 slots, so that's what we're going to work with. That's what we're going to work with because I'm from New Zealand, apparently. Here are my 4 eras that I have picked. I am referring to them as the Pioneers, the Atomic Age, the New Wave, and the Computing Age. And while I am a massive fan of some modern 21st century authors, I'm not going to be including those because even though I think something like The Three-Body Problem is going to be a future classic, we just haven't had quite enough time to see its significance and influence on the genre just yet. So without any further ado, let's get into my selections, starting with the Pioneers. And here were the authors I nominated for this category: H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, Mary Shelley, Edgar Rice Burroughs, E.E. Doc Smith, and Olaf Stapledon. So these authors represent quite a wide time period, but I think they are all foundational when it comes to early science fiction as well as proto-science fiction. So let's get into them, starting with H.G. Wells. Wrote The Time Machine and The War of the Worlds and others. Created some of the tropes such as time travel. That was actually the first book to ever use a device, a machine, to travel through time, the Time Machine. And The War of the Worlds, obviously very influential on alien invasion stories. Jules Verne, more of that kind of adventure sci-fi category. Edgar Rice Burroughs a little bit as well, but more of that Sword and Planet with A Princess of Mars. Also wrote Tarzan. I'm not going to count that in today's video, but obviously another very notable work in his bibliography. And then Mary Shelley, who did write other things, but obviously most well known for Frankenstein, one of my favorite books. And I saw the Guillermo del Toro film recently. Should I talk about that? Yeah, why not? It was pretty good. I don't think it had the thematic depth of the book, but visually, I thought it was amazing, great tone, good spooky season movie. So we're past Halloween now, but if you're still in the mood, might scratch that itch for you. Then moving on to, who did we have? Olaf Stapledon, more sort of like philosophical sci-fi, a little slower, kind of like big ideas, definitely influential on some of the more concept-driven sci-fi that was to come later on. And then E.E. Doc Smith wrote a number of kind of space opera type books, the Lensman series probably being his most well-known. So all highly influential, all very successful foundational authors to the genre. Who am I putting on my mountains? Well, for Mount Jonathan, I'm selecting Mary Shelley. I know some people might think that just one notable work isn't maybe enough to get them on the mountain, but Frankenstein is just such a titanic piece of literature. Not just in science fiction, but in horror and Gothic literature, just still studied in English classes to this day for a reason. It's one of my favorite books of all time, and It's kind of like a video game where a character might just have one move or one weapon that's kind of overpowered and you just use that one over and over again. But if it's that good, it's still a very playable character, and I think Mary Shelley is still a very deserving selection on Mount Jonathan. Moving over to Mount Rushmore, I'm going to select H.G. Wells. I think his books like The Time Machine, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The War of the Worlds, The Invisible Man are all just too influential. They created and set the standard for so many popular sci-fi tropes, and authors were copying, replicating, inspired by his works for decades, if not more than a century to come. And he wrote before a lot of science fiction awards were created, seeing he was at sort of the beginning of science fiction, but he was actually nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature 4 times. So it wasn't just a niche audience that he was writing for. He wrote science fiction that captured the minds of a wide range of people, and I think he is deserving of a place on science fiction's Mount Rushmore. And just before we get to our next era, at the end of the video, I'm going to be spinning the quantum wheel in order to see which sci-fi book will be picked as the patron pick of the month. All right, up next, for the Atomic Age authors, I have nominated Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Robert A. Heinlein, Alfred Bester, Ray Bradbury, and A.E. Van Vogt. So here we have a group of authors that were not only masters of the science fiction short story, often published in magazines at the time, but also as science fiction started to become more popular in the novel format, these authors wrote books that were pretty defining in that classic era of science fiction. So going through them, we have Isaac Asimov, a very prolific author, but probably most well known for his Foundation and Robot series, included a lot of science in his writing as well as big ideas. Then we have Robert A. Heinlein, who perhaps a little bit more philosophical and political, and some of his most well-known works include Starship Troopers, Stranger in a Strange Land, and The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. We also have Arthur C. Clarke, fairly hard sci-fi writer, big ideas with science, and kind of wrote over a long period of time. He kind of crosses a few decades, but I think he belongs with these authors, and he wrote Childhood's End, Rendezvous with Rama, and 2001: A Space Odyssey. Then we have Ray Bradbury, who kind of wrote in a few different genres, but I think is definitely a science fiction author with Fahrenheit 451 and The Martian Chronicles, leaving quite the legacy. Known for his prose, a beautiful writer, Ray Bradbury. Then we have A.E. Van Vogt, who wrote some things like Slan, The Weapons Shop of Isha, or Aisha, apologies for not knowing the pronunciation, and The Voyage of the Space Beagle. If you're watching this video first, you haven't seen my trivia game video, that might help you out in the trivia game. Get yourself a couple points there. And finally, we have Alfred Bester, probably most well known for The Star's My Destination, also titled Tiger Tiger, which is arguably proto-cyberpunk in a way, kind of combines some cyberpunk space opera elements with a revenge story, and The Demolished Man, which does some interesting things with structure and formatting. So of these 6 Atomic Age authors, who am I going to place on the mountain? Well, for Mount Jonathan, I have selected Arthur C. Clarke. He is one of my favorite authors. I really just like his style of science fiction. The big ideas, the concepts, the existential questions, combined with hard science, and I don't think he's the best character writer, but I do think his prose is a little bit underrated. I actually really like Clarke's writing style, and Childhood's End in particular and 2001: A Space Odyssey are some of my all-time favorite reads. Moving over to Mount Rushmore, I ended up going with Isaac Asimov. I think you could make the case for a couple of different authors here. I considered putting Clarke on Mount Rushmore as well, but Asimov, I think he was just too prolific. He was nominated at too many awards, he won too many awards. The Gods Themselves is another Hugo winner, and The End of Eternity, I think, is his most underrated book. I think it's possibly the best time travel story ever written. So when you combine that success with his influence on the genre, the way that Foundation influenced empires and things like that in space operas and his robot series with I, Robot and his subsequent novels, his influence on AI, robots, androids, the way they were depicted in science fiction for years to come, I think makes him a worthy winner. However, if you were to permit me a little bit of a rant here, something I encounter quite frequently is people saying something along the lines of, did you know Asimov discovered the 3 laws of robotics? And we still use those laws in the field of robotics to this day. And I'm like, no, he didn't. And no, we don't. All right, let's go through the laws. They are robots must not hurt humans, must obey humans, and must protect themselves in that order of priority. It's pretty cool. It's a great setup for a story. But there is nothing novel or inherently true or scientific about those laws, okay? We have to stop treating them like they're Newton's laws of physics, okay? They're just a clever and catchy and concise way of introducing fun logic problems and contradictions into a story, okay? It's not real science. Nobody's ever tried to make a robot, a killer robot, and then been like, dang, the laws of robotics prevent me from doing so. Okay, there's nothing true about them. It's not real science. It's just cool storytelling. Anyway, moving on to the new wave authors. My nominees were Philip K. Dick, Frank Herbert, Ursula K. Le Guin, Larry Niven, Stanislav Lem, and Kurt Vonnegut. Okay, here we have a time period with some science fiction authors exploring some softer sciences, some social sciences, and incorporating some topics and issues that were newer at the time, maybe to do with war or drugs or psychology, things like that. So let's get into the authors. Starting off with Philip K. Dick, it's kind of hard to summarize Philip K. Dick. He wrote over 40 novels, a ton of short stories, and he liked to explore things to do with identity and reality. A lot of his books are kind of trippy and surreal and explore these kind of existential and spiritual questions. Some of his most famous works, in part due to adaptations, include Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was the basis for Blade Runner, as well as The Man in the High Castle and A Scanner Darkly, as well as 2 of my other favorites from him, Ubik and The 3 Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch. And then we had Frank Herbert, who is a little bit similar to Mary Shelley in the sense that he is most well known for one work, that being Dune. Although he did write some other books and he had sequels in the Dune series, which are a little bit divisive, but overall pretty popular. I like the series, especially the first 4. So whatever you think of his other books, though, I think that Dune is just so big, so iconic. Herbert deserves to be in consideration for Mount Rushmore. I've heard it cited quite a few times that it's the most highest selling, clever way of phrasing that, Jonathan, the most highest selling science fiction book of all time. Although I would wager Frankenstein or 1984 might have higher sales, but they're not always considered science fiction. So wherever you place him on that list, whether it's first or close to being first, it's just such an important book in the genre. Herbert has to be in consideration. Then we also have Ursula K. Le Guin, known for exploring philosophical, political, and social themes with some of her most famous works, including The Left Hand of Darkness, The Dispossessed, and The Lathe of Heaven. And after that, we had Stanislav Lem, a Polish science fiction author who wrote about big existential questions, probably his most famous book being Solaris, trying to communicate with something that perhaps we might not ever even be able to understand. Then we had Larry Niven, who combined hard science fiction with interesting aliens in his books Ringworld and The Mote in God's Eye, which he co-wrote with Jerry Pournelle. And finally, Kurt Vonnegut, who wrote science fiction as well as sort of more literary science fiction. He kind of gets grouped into sort of postmodern, post-structuralist writing, but he wrote about robots, aliens, and time travel, things like that in Slaughterhouse-Five, The Science of Titan, Cat's Cradle, and many other fantastic books. So who did I pick for Mount, Jonathan? Well, it had to be my favorite writer of all time, Kurt Vonnegut. I don't think I've ever been as impacted intellectually and emotionally as I have while been reading Kurt Vonnegut's books. He's my favorite writer of all time, and while not everything he wrote was science fiction, there's 7 or 8 books of his that are undeniably science fiction, and I think that makes him worthy of being considered for this category. And even if it wasn't, if I was going to make for an exception for anybody, it would be Kurt Vonnegut. My most prized possession is a signed limited edition copy of Deadeye Dick by Kurt Vonnegut, and Slaughterhouse-Five, Cat's Cradle, The Sirens of Titan, Mother Night, Bluebeard, so many others. I just 5-star, 10 out of 10, love them till I die books. This was the easiest selection of all. All right, let's stop gushing. It's time to be objective. Who did I select for Mount Rushmore? I went with Ursula K. Le Guin. This was a tough one as there were a couple of different authors I could have gone with. Philip K. Dick was right up there, but I think Ursula K. Le Guin, in terms of the critical acclaim, she was just nominated for so many awards, won so many awards, very influential. PKD, extremely influential as well, but I think when it comes to literary science fiction, feminist science fiction, Ursula K. Le Guin deserves a lot of credit and commercially successful as well. And she wrote other books that I'm not really considering, like Earthsea, because that's a little bit more fantasy as well. But yeah, the entire scope of her writing, her bibliography, I think puts her right at the top and is a deserving selection for science fiction's Mount Rushmore. And finally, for the computing age, my nominations were William Gibson, Margaret Atwood, Octavia E. Butler, Dan Simmons, Orson Scott Card, and Ian M. Banks. So you might consider these authors to be modern authors, but I think that books written in the 80s and 90s, we have had enough time to see their influence on the genre. There's probably been a couple of generations of authors since then, and we can see how these authors have inspired cyberpunk, space opera, other genres for decades to come since their release. And let's dig into who I think was the most important, the most influential from the computing age. So getting into the authors, we're going to start with William Gibson, who is most well known for Neuromancer, which didn't necessarily start cyberpunk, but I think set the standard for cyberpunk. It defined what it would be for decades to come. And he did write other popular books within the Sprawl trilogy and other cyberpunk books, but Neuromancer is definitely the one with the longest lasting legacy. And then we had Margaret Atwood, who I know doesn't necessarily love the title of science fiction. I think she prefers speculative fiction, but I consider to be sci-fi. Margaret, you're welcome on the team. Welcome to Team Sci-Fi. And her most well-known work is The Handmaid's Tale, which I think was one of the most influential books on bringing back the popularity of the dystopian genre, and I think one of the best dystopian books. And then we had Octavia E. Butler, most well known for Kindred, The Parable of the Sower and her Earthseed duology, as well as Dawn and her Xenogenesis trilogy. So these are all imaginative sci-fi books that include social issues, gender issues, racial issues, and she writes in a really kind of like dry, matter-of-fact style and just sort of lets the themes and ideas be the focus of her stories. And then we had Dan Simmons, most well known for Hyperion. And myself, I am either famously or infamously known for preferring the sequel, The Fall of Hyperion. Either way, love the book, love the series, big fan of all 4 books in the Hyperion Cantos, as well as his Ilium and Olympos duology. Now, Simmons is an author that didn't just write in science fiction, he writes in hybrid genres, he writes in other genres, but either way, he's known for his literary, historical references, excellent prose, character work, really kind of brings like an elevated approach to science fiction, space opera, and other subgenres. After that, we had Orson Scott Card, most well known for Ender's Game, which some people consider to be YA, but I think it has a lot of depth to it with the tactics, the character writing, the philosophy, and I know a lot of people enjoy other books in the Ender's series, especially The Speaker for the Dead, but Ender's Game probably his most popular. And finally, we have Ian M. Banks, best known for his Culture series, a space opera series which I think played a large role in bringing back the popularity of the space opera. It had fallen out of favor for a while, but is now quite popular with authors like Peter F. Hamilton, Alistair Reynolds, Werner Vinci, and of that crowd, I think Banks was the first to do it, and he did it very well. So who is going on Mount Jonathan? Well, I ended up selecting Dan Simmons. The Hyperion Cantos is arguably my favorite science fiction series of all time. I really enjoy all 4 books, with The Fall of Hyperion being one of my favorite books ever. And I felt like Ilium and Olympus, while I had a few more gripes with it, had some amazing high points as well. But who did I select for Mount Rushmore? I did go in another direction. I went with William Gibson. I don't think there is another author as synonymous with a single subgenre of science fiction. If I were to name other subgenres of sci fi like space opera or time travel or dystopias, you could probably think of a couple of authors that deserve to be at the top of that list. But when I say cyberpunk, there can only be one, and that is William Gibson. I read Neuromancer quite a few years ago, and I liked it. I respected it. I appreciated it. But I don't think I fully understood it. It was a bit of a tough read. I'm not sure it's the best place to start for a newer reader to science fiction, but I recently went back to it with a bit more sci fi under my belt. And I still didn't understand everything, but I did like it a lot more. I did really enjoy the prose, the vibes, and just the cyberpunk ideas that permeate through not just cyberpunk literature, but through film, video game, all other science fiction media as well. So I think William Gibson has to be on Mount Rushmore. So there you go. These were my final results. From Mount Jonathan, I selected Mary Shelley, Arthur C. Clarke, Kurt Vonnegut, and Dan Simmons. And for Mount Rushmore, I went with H.G. Wells, Isaac Asimov, Ursula K. Le Guin, and William Gibson. Let me know what you think of these picks, and let me know in the comments who you would have chosen for your Mount Rushmore of sci-fi. Editing Jonathan here. I forgot to include this earlier, but here are the results from the poll where I asked you guys to vote on who you think should be on the Mount Rushmore of science fiction, and these are the authors that got the most votes, with the top 4 being H.G. Wells, Isaac Asimov, Philip K. Dick, and Arthur C. Clarke. So I don't think we're in too much of a disagreement here because all of these authors were either on one of my mountains or were at the top of my considerations. So that's good to see. All right, just quickly before we go, I'm going to spin the quantum wheel in order to find out the patron pick of the month for November. Welcome to the quantum wheel, where all of the patron picks are both simultaneously picked and not picked until we observe a winner. Let's find out what I'll be reading in the month of November. Will it be a Mount Rushmore author? Will it be another all-time great book? I hope so. Let's see what the wheel picks for us. Could be Downward to the Earth, or maybe Modoran. Modoran steals it. Modoran by David R. Bunch. Okay, so I have read a short story by David R. Bunch that I really liked, and I'm looking forward to Modoran because it's a series of shorts that are kind of stitched together into a novel, and I think I'm going to like this book. I liked his style. Let me know if you've read Bunch or Modoran, and if not, check it out. See if it sounds interesting, and join us. Read it in the month of November. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, smash or just gently click the subscribe button. And if you really enjoyed it, consider checking out the perks of becoming a Patreon member, where you can become one of my robots, androids, or cyborgs, like Nima, a New Eden, Half-Ogre, Sakawe, Samil, and the Landmark Colin. And you can find more sci-fi content over here.